If anything, Trump's phony presidency has entered into a whole different phase. The editorial board of the Washington Post says it's a new Imperial phase. I call it a fascist or a totalitarian phase. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, is allowing this to happen. McConnell has totally given up his role of advice and consent. He did it as soon as Obama secured the presidency, when Mitch McConnell said that his main objective, and he wasn't speaking ironically or sarcastically, when he said his main objective as leader of the Senate was to make sure that Obama was a one-term president, which didn't work out. But you've heard this before. Somebody says, well, imagine how Republicans would have responded if Barack Obama had tried this, declaring a state of emergency to bypass Congress, where it concerned Article 1 of the Constitution, that the only entity within the U.S. government that has the power of the purse is the House of Representatives. But Democrats say that every time this Trump bastard comes up with something new. Imagine how Republicans... And the Post points out, in the case of Trump's declaration of emergency today in order to fund his goddamn wall, it's certainly apt, saying, imagine how Republicans... For example, the Freedom Caucus, which included at one time Mick Mulvaney, who is now Trump's acting chief of staff, imagine how they would have been apoplectic if Obama would have tried something like this. But in considering this phony emergency that Trump, and he admitted this morning it was strictly a political thing. That's why his whole idea is doomed once it hits the courts. How is the Solicitor General, who is going to have to defend Trump's action before the Supreme Court, because it will go to the Supreme Court, how is the Solicitor General going to be able to stand in front of the Supreme Court and declare, yes, it is an emergency, yes, emergency powers are needed, when Trump himself said it was purely political this morning? Christ. Imagine, indeed, the Post points out, if 2 years from now, a President, Cory Booker or Harris or Warren or Bennet, whatever, seizing on the Parkland massacre anniversary that we talked about yesterday, invoked emergency powers to halt the killing of innocent people by banning the sale of semi-automatic weapons, imposing uniform background checks for gun purchases, or levying a stiff federal surtax on the sale of gun parts and ammunition. Now, the power of emergency would be well used in that instance, wouldn't it? Because the Congress will never, ever pass comprehensive gun control laws. It will not happen. So that would be a perfect time for a president, Democrat, to invoke executive authority to declare a state of emergency and say, okay, here's our emergency. People are going into schools and theaters and shopping malls and churches and synagogues and wiping out scores of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people. That is an emergency. The Post points out, if an emergency can be manufactured over border security, when illegal border crossings are near a 20-year low, as measured by the Border Patrol in their number of arrests, then it pretty much is snap to make the case for an emergency over gun deaths, which are at a 20-year high. And then the Post goes on. It seems logical that Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, having approved Mr. Trump's emergency, as he did yesterday, would acquiesce in future such emergency declarations. Wouldn't you think? Of course not. By becoming a rubber stamp for Mr. Trump, however, Mr. McConnell has set a precedent that he is prepared to accept any president who would treat the will of Congress and the Constitution with cavalier contempt. Make no mistake, that's precisely what Trump does. That's what he has done. His bullshit about a border wall having failed to convince the legislative branch, which did forge a deal that came up with less than a quarter of the funds he was demanding. So since he failed and fucked up and Nancy Pelosi just kicked his ass, he's decided by his emergency declaration simply to render the legislative branch of the U.S. government inoperative. That's what dictators and autocrats and Nazis and fascists the world over have done. They take the power away from the people and put it into their own hands. And it's not what the framers had in mind when, in putting together the Constitution, they vested the power of the purse in the hands of the people. The House of Representatives. That means something. The House of Representatives. Trump says, fuck that. Fuck that. It was in the exercise of that power that 17 lawmakers of both parties spent the past 2 weeks hammering out details of a measure to fund the government, including $1.375 billion to construct 55 miles of new fencing in the Rio Grande Valley. That measure cleared the Senate easily with broad bipartisan support. The president's response was, in effect, to say, so what? White House aides said before his little masturbatory exercise this morning in the Rose Garden that Trump would identify other funding sources other than going through the Congress, through the House, which he's supposed to do. Mulvaney said last weekend, quote, "We'll go off and find the money someplace else legally," end quote. Anyway, by his declaration of a state of emergency and opening up the use of emergency powers to him, Trump is inaugurating a new imperial phase of his presidency. And McConnell, who, if I remember just recently, McConnell warned Trump, don't do that. Don't do that. McConnell will now show that he has perfected a trick. What's the trick? Roll over and play dead. That's McConnell's trick. Jesus Christ. These Republicans, huh? Now, you know, all your life, you have known that at best, Republicans elected to office were suspect. That's been my framework to establish my political attitudes ever since I was probably in my mid-20s. When it started to occur to me that most Republicans were Christian and that most of them were liars. The office holders who ran as a Republican Christian, once they were in office and they were available for scrutiny, it became obvious that they were liars. And I can remember thinking, how could that be? They're Christians. They're Christians. My grandmother was a Christian, and she told me that one of the commandments was not to bear false witness, not to lie. So how can these adult men, and they were all men back then, how can these Christian adult men who get elected to the Congress, how can they lie the way they're lying? They're not supposed to do that. Isn't that sweet and innocent? They're not supposed to do that. But then it became apparent to me that stereotyping Republican Christians as liars was in fact an expected outcome of listening to them. And then I discovered there were an awful lot of Democratic politicians who are Christian who were also liars. So it seemed to be the common denominator there was not Republican or Democrat, but Christian. What the fuck? That was a real eye-opener for me. But as the years went on, and I realized that Democrats, while a lot of Democratic politicians could lie with the best of them, some of them even better than the best of them, that for the most part, the Democratic Party was, back when it was a party of coalition building, that it was a party that had at its core the interest of the American people. And that the Republican Party had at its core the interest of the capitalist elite. Very simply. But now we have entered a new phase with Donald Trump. It's no longer the capitalist elite. Oh, they're still there, and they're still there, and they're still clawing at the rungs of power. But now it is fascist control that the Republican Party is all about. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.